All rise for the jury, please. You may be seated.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. We're about to begin closing arguments. As I've explained to you before, the state always gets the first word and the last word in every criminal proceeding, and this is no exception. And so I'm going to turn to defense counsel first for them to present their closing argument to you, and then the state will finish that up. And after, depending upon the length of those arguments to you, we'll take a recess in between those arguments and my instructions, or even between arguments. I will try to keep a pulse on how long things are going and whether or not you need a break in between. So without further ado, Attorney Nye, I'll call upon you to present the closing argument.
What happened after Ella and Gavin went to bed on April 3rd, 2019? That is the question the state cannot answer with a step-by-step sequence, as they did with the days and the months before Maureen Argie's tragic death and the days after. That is the question that Bill Argie answered for you, and at the time he was arraigned on the charges. I am not guilty. The question is not which happened, whether Bill Argie murdered his wife or whether his wife took her life. The question is whether the state proved each element of the crime charge beyond a reasonable doubt. For that reason, I will be reviewing the evidence to show why the state did not meet its burden. I'm going to start with the experts' observations of the injuries, which are not conclusive as to the cause and manner of death. While the expert said that the injuries were consistent with homicide, she also said that the types of injuries that she noted are consistent with suicides. Suicide by ligature, specifically, and ligature that doesn't have to be a thin strip, but also can be a wide strip, and such a strip would not leave a mark on the neck. Suicide by ligature can result in petechiae. Suicide by ligature can result in a bruise on the neck, which is caused by a compression, including a ligature squeezing the neck with the weight of the body as it rolls off the bed. There is no evidence that Maureen died where the body was found by the police officer. The injuries do not tell it was done by another person beyond a reasonable doubt. Remember what Trooper Anderson said, what the investigators were told after the autopsy was concluded. He said that the cause and manner of death had not been determined, was inconclusive. When the medical examiner completed her report on May 14, 2019, she was still not absolutely certain. She said probable homicide by asphyxiation. She held that opinion until the night before she testified. She even held that opinion while I examined her by deposition this summer. What changed her mind? 2 years of added experience to who already 2 years of experience? Or was it bias? The bias of information that this was a contentious divorce? The bias of information that somebody said, somebody like Mr. Timbus said that my client allegedly solicited him to murder? In addition, the medical examiner said she ruled out suicide after reviewing Maureen's medical records and noted one entry about the depression and said it was without suicidal ideations. Well, if you recalled her primary physician testifying, Maureen never underwent a diagnosis, a formal diagnosis. She refused any diagnosis, she refused treatment, and she refused counseling. What we did learn when I pointed out to the primary physician that there was actually another entry about depression is that Maureen Argie lived with untreated depression since at least 2015, quietly, silently. The doctors that testified, particularly the medical examiner, is not an expert in psychiatry, not an expert in psychology. What about the fact that there is no note, which is another thing that the medical examiner pointed out? What about it? Is there a manual that says one leaves note when one's thinking about committing suicide? Suicides are unpredictable. That's what makes them so tragic. Think about the news about celebrities that supposedly committed suicide. Some of them are unexpected. Nobody predicted it. People say that Maureen had so much to look forward to. But her future depended on Bill's agreeing to the custody arrangement and to sell the house. What Maureen thought was a well-laid plan, once again being disrupted by Bill. This was not a new struggle for Maureen. It was one that existed as long as she had been suffering from the depression. Then there were so-called threats against Bill's wife and the solicitation of murder supposedly made by Bill. Consider the source of the solicitation and the so-called threats against his life and complaints, his wife. Bill vents, he's emotional, and he likes to talk. All the guys talk, locker room talk, guy talk. What was said at the table stayed at the table. All of them assumed that he was kidding. Why all of a sudden does it become something they should have taken seriously? Because he talked about the methods of killing? Because he talked about faking a suicide, hiring a hitman? If Bill said all these things, sure did a lousy job in following through with it. Jamie Timbers was the first to call the police rather than the police contacting him because he knew he had damaging messages on Bill's phone and he wanted to cover up. He wanted to shine the light on Bill and not himself. And that's why he made up the story about the hitman. The reason why the state presented more than what the autopsy reports has to say and what Billy vented about over the years is that they needed more evidence. But even through digging the text messages, videos, Billy's statements, financial records, gambling records, they all do not tell you what actually happened after Ella and Gavin went to bed on the night of April 3, 2019. We heard a lot about this marriage. It's a tragic marriage. It's an unhappy marriage since 2019. But it's an unhappy marriage that went both ways. 1 year, Bill wanted a divorce. Then Maureen complained about it. Then Bill wanted a divorce. It was a struggle that existed for at least 4 years. Why all of a sudden 2019 makes the difference? The stress of the marriage was nothing new in the spring of 2019. The addiction and the unemployment was nothing new in the spring of 2019. Maureen had asked for help as early as 2017. There was an intervention in 2018. These conditions are nothing new in 2019. How does anyone react to finding a spouse who died from suicide with 2 kids in the house? Bill chose to make sure that his kids did not see her with a ligature around her neck, and he chose to make sure that they did not see the home by having his mother pick them up. But after that, as we all talked about during the trial, Bill's an addict. What do addicts do under stress? They run to the source of the addiction, and that's what Bill did. He could think of nothing but getting to a casino where he can escape from the reality of his wife's death. It wasn't something he planned to do forever. He wasn't trying to hide. He was trying to ease the pain. If he wanted to run, he surely did a lousy job of it. We were shown financial records. Interestingly, we were only shown 3 months of the financial records. What about the last 4 years? How do we know that those were any different? How was it any different or any more severe? Bill had been working per diem. He had been gambling, then working, gambling, and working. What made this spring any different in financial conditions than the prior ones? Then there's Bill's closest friends. There's Dan, who claims to have heard that Bill said that he wanted to kill his wife. Dan hasn't seen Bill since 2018. Maybe they talked at Ray's wedding, but they certainly hadn't been friends since then. What memory is Dan relying on? Because there were a lot of other people at that intervention, and none of them said anything about attempting to kill his wife. Then you have TJ. TJ was just a loud guy at the restaurant who didn't like seeing his friends gamble. But he didn't do anything else, because that's all Bill was doing, is gambling. Finally, there's his friend, close friend, Ray Karen. Ray Karen didn't say anything about Bill making threats against his wife. None of his friends have anything to say about what was happening with Bill and his wife in the spring of 2019. Ray had a phone conversation on March 29th, but before that, they were not close to Bill, and they certainly were not close to Maureen. What about Bill's statements? Bill talked to Ray on the one-party recorded call. He talked to the police, and he talked to the grand jury. At each of those times, Bill knew that he was probably a suspect, and he acted accordingly. He waited until he had his time in court to give his full statement. The life insurance policy. Heard a lot about that. Something that was left out on the ironing board. They were packing and moving. Jamie Timbus may have known about the life insurance policy, but he didn't think it meant anything when he learned about it. And again, this was the motive for what happened in this case. Bill surely did a lousy job of it. And you heard about family members trying to talk with Bill in the weeks before Maureen's tragic death. Remember, Bill was being told what was happening, what the decisions were. And he was grappling with the reality of the separation. He spoke with Maureen's parents. He spoke with his sister Kelly, texted with Karen and spoke with Karen, spoke with his mother. In none of these situations did he threaten to kill Maureen. He was trying to process what was happening. He was trying to process what his anger was. And his anger, his upset, his distraught. And then you may think, well, what about that 911 call that Maureen made just before, the weekend before? But think about why she made the 911 call. She had just spoken with her friends, one of her friends, a day or two before, saying that Bill was threatening suicide. What her friend told her was, the next time he does that, call the police. So why wasn't the 911 call could be because Maureen was checking, not for herself, but for the alleged threats of suicide being made by Bill. The most interesting part about what happened with that spring, you know, Bill's anger, Bill's distraught, why struggling about the divorce, whether he'd hit rock bottom, and this, what happened on that night on April 3rd, is Bill's efforts to get out of rock bottom. He did what people should do when they're down. He reached out to his friend and talked to Ray Karen. He reached out to Dan and said, I want to reconnect. He reached out to his sponsor and said, hey, I need some help. If there is a case where the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt is needed to assure the community that the jury's decision is fair, it's this one. There are many witnesses who dislike Bill, who are angry with Bill and immediately thought of Bill as a suspect without knowing the evidence. Although it is tempting to follow the witnesses' emotions, their pain and anguish, the instructions ask that you set those emotions aside. The instructions on proof beyond a reasonable doubt has already been given by the court, and I anticipate that the state will say, hey, this suicide defense is frivolous. The state's about to get up and go through the life since the intervention, focus on the weeks and days before, from one text to another. When you look at the evidence, I asked you, when you look at the totality of the evidence, to reach into your life experiences and ask yourself, how do events happen? We all like to believe that they happen like a story. That's what we do when we get together at family gatherings, is we compare stories about an event that happened years before, and inevitably they're different. They're different because each of us has to construct a story that makes sense to us. But this case is not about picking one particular story. It's about whether the evidence that I have reviewed with you, when you mix them up and you put them together, really meets the state's burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Ask yourself if the state's story is too narrow. Some people like to think that life is a straight line. Others think it's chaos. That we approach a difficult event with the best we have and live life until we get to the next difficult event, but they're not necessarily related. Maureen Argie's death is tragic, but Bill Argie did not murder her.
Thank you, Attorney Nunn.